Hello and welcome to Bristol Reptile Emporium's YouTube channel. I'm Gail.
And I'm Michelle.
And today we are going to talk about royal pythons. So Michelle, who do we have here?
So we've got two different colour morphs of royals here. So you're holding an albino and I'm holding an Enchi. It's quite a dark Enchi, to be fair.
Okay, and how long will these guys live?
So these guys will live approximately 25 years.
Oh, so quite a while then.
Yeah, they're quite a commitment on time scale. So if you are considering a royal as a possible pet, you do want to take that into consideration.
Definitely. And what sort of size will they get to?
So your average adult will reach around 5 foot, which is about 1.5 meters. These guys aren't fully grown yet, so they've got a lot more growing to do. But obviously the albino is a little bit older than the Enchi.
I see, okay. So what type of food would these guys have?
So we'd be feeding these guys at this sort of size, either on medium mice or large mice, depending on the bigger one. The albino now we'll probably start introducing to rats because you've got larger sizes of the rats. Royals aren't a particularly small snake when they finish growing, so rats can be more beneficial because they just go up into a bigger size range. But there are other rodents we could use as well, so we could use Maltese, which is an African rodent, which would be similar to what they would be feeding on in the wild, because obviously they're found in the same areas.
Right, actually. And how often would we feed?
So how frequency of feeding does vary depending on the snake and also on the owner. So some owners will feed slightly larger food a little bit less frequently, so maybe once a fortnight or once every 3 weeks, and some owners prefer to do it a little bit more regularly so that they don't forget and it's easier for them to check and monitor, and they'll do that with slightly smaller food items more frequently, so weekly. There is no real right or wrong answer. There will be some people that have different opinions on this subject. It's very common. It splits opinion quite easily, but it's really down to your animal. There are some animals that will only feed on certain food items as frequently as they like, so we need to take the animal into consideration when we are feeding.
Right, okay, so it's all down to their preference and the owner's preference. A lot of variables really.
They're right.
So it's best to sort of seek advice and have a chat with somebody.
And get to know your pet, especially if it's a first pet. Don't panic if it does something that you don't expect. It's very common for royals to go off their food for periods of time. And yeah, that's very normal behaviour. So as I say, keep communicating if you've purchased it from a shop. Keep communicating with the individuals that you've bought it from and see if that's normal behaviour for that animal.
Right, I see. Okay. So obviously we can handle these animals quite clearly, yeah?
Yes.
How often can we handle?
So we can handle very frequently, so we may choose to do that on almost a daily basis, but we do need to take a couple of factors into consideration.
Okay.
So the main one is feeding. So we wouldn't handle on the day of feeding, and we also wouldn't handle the day after feeding.
Right.
If you think about how a snake feeds, it takes a big food item, and it's got to digest that, so it needs time to do it. If we start handling too quickly after we've fed, there is a possibility that we can disturb the snake with the food item in the digestive system, and that can encourage regurgitation.
Right.
Which obviously we want to try and avoid.
Oh, absolutely. We want them to properly digest their food before we handle them.
Very much so.
Yeah.
The other time that we need to be considerate is when we see the animal go into shed. So normally with snakes, they go a milky blue colour, which generally gets referred to as the snake being in blue. Okay. And when that happens, we may have anything between a week to a fortnight before we'll find the skin in the enclosure with the animal. And it will go that milky blue colour, which sometimes we see, sometimes we don't. And then it will return back to its normal coloration before it sheds the skin. So a lot of people, especially new owners, do get quite worried because they'll see the animal go into blue and they'll think, oh, it hasn't shed. And this time period will start to elapse and they get more and more concerned. But that's really normal. It's a natural process. As I say, it can take a variable amount of time. Sometimes it'll be a couple of days. Sometimes anything up to a fortnight before the animal will actually shed that skin.
I see. And I suppose the reason that you don't want to handle when they're shed is because they can't really see properly, or what would be the reason?
So it's quite a big process for a reptile to be shedding, and obviously it does affect temperament at that point. So a normally very placid animal can be just a little bit tetchy, a bit sensitive.
Right.
You'll know yourself if you've got stuff going on if you're feeling unwell or you're feeling a bit off, you don't want to be mucked around with, and that's exactly the same for reptiles basically.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So when we can handle them, how long long can we hold them for?
Well, again, it's going to depend on the age of the animal, what it's used to being handled, all those sorts of factors are what we need to take into account. So if it's a new animal to you and you're not very used to it, we're going to start off with short periods of time and we're going to build them up. So I mean, there's some owners that when they've had a snake for a long period of time may have it out for a couple of hours, you know, depending on the room temperature and things like that. Again, variables affect activity levels when they're out. But if it's new to you, build it up slowly, get used to the animal, and it's just a case of repetition when we're handling.
Okay. So what type of enclosure would we house these guys in?
So snakes are notorious for having territories. And this is something that we need to bear in mind when we're doing enclosures for snakes. So with royals, it's not uncommon for the size of the enclosure to affect its behaviour. So if we go too big, in some cases, it can upset the snake and it can affect things like feeding and things like that. Okay. So normally what most people will take into consideration is the size of the snake, and they'll aim to keep it in an enclosure where the body length is about, the longest length of the enclosure is about 2/3 the overall length of the snake, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So most people tend to house adults or sub-adults depending on its individual size, because like people, you get big snakes, you get small snakes. They tend to house adults in either 3 or 4 foot enclosures.
Oh, okay. So you need a little bit of space then to be able to handle one of these or house one of these.
A little bit of room, yeah. I mean, they do take up a bit more space than some of the other species that we've looked at.
Makes sense. And what sort of light and heat do you provide?
So snakes at the moment, it's not, light is not something that we're saying they have to have UV and things like that, because they obtain their nutrients slightly differently to some of the lizards. Although if you do provide UV, it does show to have positive effect, which is something we're seeing across the board with all the reptile species. So although we're not saying that UV is imperative, if it's something that you can put on your setup, it's really nice. And then some individuals in smaller enclosures will use visual lighting, and that could be in the form of LEDs to make it easier to view the animal. But it's not essential, so it's down to your preference. The big one is how we provide heat, and they do come from Africa, so they do like it fairly warm. So we aim for a basking spot in the region about 30, 32. Some people go a little bit warmer than that, but generally to keep a royal feeding quite comfortably, we need to have something in the region of about 30 to 32.
So quite warm then?
Yeah, as I say, they are an African species and they do need it fairly warm, quite a high air temperature. So not just the surface temperature, we're looking at air temperatures here. They need to be quite high to keep the snakes active.
Okay. And what sort of substrate do we put them on?
This is a matter of massive discussion at the moment.
Right.
Like lots of things with keeping reptiles, there's loads of opinion as what is right and wrong, and really that's down to preference of what you like. As long as it's not something that's got a really fine particle that can go under the scale and cause irritation, there are lots of different options. So some of our owners in store will use paper pellet, they might use a beech chip, some of our owners use orchid bark. There is a whole host of different substrates that you can and can't use, and some owners will just keep them either on sheet paper or even paper towel with younger animals.
Oh, right, so quite a variety. And what about water?
So it's really good to provide royals with a water bowl, and with any snake species we normally advise a bowl that's big enough for the animal to get into. So snakes do like water, they'll use it to help regulate their body temperature as well. So if they are a bit warm, hopefully that won't be the case, because you'll have your enclosure regulated by a thermostat to prevent it from overheating. But they will position themselves closer to heated elements and then move away from it. That's very normal. So you do want a water bowl that's big enough for your animal to get into, and obviously allow for water displacement too. So when you've got a 5 foot snake getting in a water bowl, that's quite a lot of water if the bowl's full.
It does. So as they grow, you'll have to increase your water bowl size as well?
Yeah, so we literally would. So with a setup, we'd start off in a smaller setup with a younger snake, and we'd increase the size of the setup as the animal grows, and the equipment that we're using, so things like hides and water bowls, we're increasing that as well at the same rate as the animal grows.
Right, okay. Is there anything else that we need in the enclosure, say any plants or hides?
Yeah, so we want to provide ideally 2 hides within the enclosure. One under the in the warm area of the enclosure, and the other at the opposite end of the enclosure. So the snake can choose with its temperature gradient where it wants to position itself and regulate that temperature, because obviously they don't produce their own body heat, so they're using the environment to regulate their body. And it's important that they have hides in different positions so that they can choose where they want to sit. Also, royals would spend a lot of time underground in the wild. In the main part of the day, they're unlikely to be out in the heat because they'd be baked because it gets so hot.
Right.
So they would spend a lot of time underground, and when you go underground, the humidity level generally increases slightly. So what we do in our enclosures is we generally will provide a damp hide. Now this could be one of the 2 hides that you've got in the enclosure anyway, and we can use medias like sphagnum moss and things like this to maintain the humidity for us, and we can just keep that hydrated as and when it needs to, top it up with a little bit of water, and that mimics some of the natural conditions we'd have them in the wild, and it helps fantastically with shedding. So when they go into shed, they're far more likely to shed the entire skin than if they've just got 2 dry hides all the time and don't have access to a damp area.
So it's a bit of sort of like health for the animal to encourage them to shed and make sure it all comes off properly.
We're just mimicking the natural environment a little bit more for them, and it just keeps them in better condition.
Great. Thank you for watching Bristol Reptile Emporium's YouTube channel.
Don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you next week for another video. Bye!
Bye!